morning. Welcome back. Hello to our friends in Wisner, Nebraska.
Yep. Good morning.
Yeah.
Okay, so our first guest is joining us today. If you saw the video, and we're going to kind of break that down, people want to know, okay, how much do you tip? When do you tip? Should you tip? And who do you tip? And so we thought we'd ask the expert, and we're very happy to have Brandon Benitz joining us today. He is, you wear a lot of hats, but he's an etiquette presenter, and he's going to kind of break it down for us. Good morning, Brandon. Thank you for coming in.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I know that you're a busy guy, but we just really need to get started. And is there just a standard rule? And JP asked this, a standard rule in tipping.
What really kicked this off was there was a video that has really gone viral about a pizza delivery guy through DoorDash that delivered a medium pizza and an order of breadsticks to a lady. The total order was $22.78. She tipped him $5. And he made a snide comment about it being a nice house for a small tip. And that's what really started this whole national conversation about tipping. It was a 22% tip, almost 23%.
I was going to say, that sounded $5 for a $22 order.
Certainly very fair in terms of.
Yeah, I would think so.
Typically in our culture, we tip 15%, which is fairly easy to figure out. We can always figure 10%.
Yeah,
you just move the decimal point over and then add half back again. And so that's pretty easy. It's even easier to figure 20% because you figure 10 and then double it. So typically between 15 and 20% is a reasonable tip. And then we get into the conversations of, should you tip? Or shouldn't I tip? Or when should you? It's always appropriate if you find someone that delivers exceptional service, go ahead and tip. Obviously for food service workers, we want to show them our generosity because typically they're getting paid $2 to $3 an hour from their employer, the restaurant, because labor is their #1 cost. And so typically they don't earn much more than $2 or $3 an hour. They're dependent upon those tips. So in that case, 15% minimum up to 20. And if you have that spirit of generosity and want to reward exceptional service, the sky's the limit.
How about the guilt feeling, the guilt trip? I mean, you notice nowadays when you go and you put your credit card in, it starts at like 20% and goes up, or else you can put in your own, or no tip. But what if you're going through a drive-through really quickly, you get a coffee, it takes all of less than 4 minutes, and you see the little tip container? Should you be tipping for something like that? That's
an important word for us to really think about here, is that idea of should I? Because if you think about it, every bar, every coffee shop, forever has always had a tip jar out. So it's always been the option too. It's a little bit more in front of you in our digital electronic society, because as soon as you swipe, there's a stop there before you can go on to your next step. Do you want to leave a tip? So it's a little bit more in front of you than it has been, but it's always been the option to tip. So if you would like to, certainly go ahead. But typically, at least in terms of what I teach and also the national conversation out there, if it's something that somebody was doing ordinarily as part of their job, like at a fast food and you're just coming in through the drive-through, you don't necessarily have to. But again, it's always the option to, just like sometimes people pay for the car behind them and create that chain of generosity going through the drive-through.
Yeah, true. Yeah. So the question too then is, what if the food was bad, but the service was good? I mean, because when you tip, are you typically tipping on the service you get, or food, or both? The combined experience? I don't know.
Any and all of the above. Typically, your tip goes to that waiter or waitress, part of the wait staff. Sometimes it's individual, meaning that person will get that tip you leave them. Sometimes in places here, even in the Tri-Cities, they share tips. So sometimes it's going to go to all of the wait staff, and if it's a larger, especially a bar, then the waitresses or the bartenders then share part of those tips to the barbacks. So they will handle the tipping and the sharing of the tips. They've got their own system. If the food is bad, but your service is excellent, those are two different conversations, because typically, very often what we see is that the cook is paid more than what the waitress is or waiter is. The wait staff are dependent upon their tips. The cook are paid directly by the owner of that establishment. So don't knock the tip because of the quality of the food. Express that to your waiter or waitress. Let them know about it so that the cooks, the chef, the owner can then improve the quality of the food. It's not their fault. They're bringing it to you.
Is it rude to ask if you, can you ask, do you keep the tip? Because that's what I do. Sometimes I go, do you keep the tip or do you have to split it? Because if you have to split the tips, I'm thinking, man, did I leave enough? Or the food was terrible, but I like you. That's
Yeah.
my biggest. I mean, truthfully, that's my biggest dilemma.
That's a great question, because in my line of work, I literally use this phrase every day. You cannot get what you do not ask for.
Okay.
And in that case, feel free to ask,
Okay.
because sometimes that may flavor, pun intended, a little bit, what kind of a tip do you leave? Because there's been times where if I know that tips are being shared, but I have phenomenal service, I'll tip a standard percentage, and then I'll tip an additional directly for that individual person. Now, then that requires us to carry cash in our digital
Right.
Yeah.
society.
A lot of times we don't
we're
have the cash.
Yeah.
back to the beaver pelts and wampum days.
Yeah.
But in that case, you've got an option there to always ask. And it's
Okay.
never a bad thing to ask, because then you want to make sure to reward that particular waiter or waitress for them providing exceptional service.
Okay, Brandon's going to stay with us because we're going to answer some more of your questions with Brandon about tipping when we come back to When We're Friends.
So we're talking about tipping with Brandon, and the question we were talking during the break. So we talked about restaurant industry, and I think people kind of get the gist of that. But what about if you go get your hair cut? And for women, sometimes if you're getting 4 or 5 colors, if you're getting a cut and a style, I mean, we're talking a lot of money that you put in if you go to one of these, like really boutique-y, expensive salons in a bigger city. Should you tip the person doing your hair?
Well, I'll take your word for it on the expensive haircut.
It's expensive.
I get mine cut once every 2 weeks. You probably don't get yours cut nearly as often as
No.
that. And it's been a fairly recent phenomenon. Typically we've always tipped, or at least for many, many years, we've tipped wait staff. But then stepping out of that, there's others in the service industry, like those who cut hair and others, where it's become over the last 15, 20, 25 years, maybe in vogue to go ahead and tip them. And in that case, personally, I always do just a little bit. But then I've got essentially a frequent flyer discount because I'm there once every 2 weeks. For somebody that may have a little bit of a larger bill when you come in, but you're doing it less often, still always appropriate to tip. And also it's appropriate to maybe find others that might not get a tip. For example, I was at a restaurant in the Tri-Cities a year or 3 ago, and there was a waitress being trained by another waitress.
Oh.
So the trainee was the one that I'm assuming got my tip, and then I left an additional tip for the trainer because she was giving up her time. I don't know if she was getting a portion of those tips or not, so I left a separate tip for her.
Wow.
It's a good idea.
Yeah. So I mean, because like you said, it's just kind of been a recent phenomenon that you're tipping. And I guess I didn't know that I was supposed to tip my hairstylist until I'm like, somebody else left the tip before me. I'm like, oh, we're supposed to do that. So say we do. Say it costs $100. Do you use the same 15%, 20%? Percentages, I guess,
Break
to tip?
down for, yeah.
There's
Yeah.
a lot of shoulds
Or-
and supposed tos out there. And
Yes.
so if you're unsure, one of the things that you can always do is just simply ask.
Okay.
What tip do you typically receive? 10%, 15%, again, is pretty standard across the board. But again, if you're going to be there once every 6 months and you've got a cut and color and a style and everything else, and you're talking $150, maybe 10% would be more along the reasonable side, because 10% of a larger bill is going to be much more
Yeah.
than 15%
Yeah.
if you're
point.
dining alone at a restaurant. So again, always ask that question.
Yeah. And so if if the service somewhere was really, really, really bad, besides talking to management, no tip? Because I know the other way I've heard people do, and this is kind of a root thing, is just leave a penny. People have done that before.
That's more passive aggressive than it is anything else. And it says
True.
more about you, the quote unquote tipper, than it
Yeah.
does anything else. If the service was that bad that you feel left to leave no tip or less than 15%, I always encourage and coach people to go ahead and have a conversation. If you don't feel comfortable having it with that server, then go ahead and have a conversation with management.
Yeah,
and honestly,
definitely.
I had that happen to me. It was at a very nice restaurant here in the Tri-Cities about 2, maybe 3 weeks ago. And for the first time ever that I've been there, it was not very good service, and one of our plates of food was not up to par. And in that case, did have a conversation with management, just letting them know, here's the reason I didn't leave a 15% tip.
And a lot of times management wants to know that.
Well, yeah.
They definitely.
Because you
and
can't
so-
get better otherwise. If
Yeah,
you just simply leave a
exactly.
penny, you don't know. If
Right.
Put on the hat of the waitress or the waiter. If they get that tip, they don't know. Is somebody having a
Right.
bad day? Did I
Yep.
do something wrong? They
Correct.
can't improve for next time.
Yeah.
And we had that conversation earlier about everybody has
Yeah.
a bad day, so
That's
just
true.
Great information, Brandon. Thank
Yeah.
you for sharing your time and your knowledge with our viewers. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you for having me. I'm honored.